The air inside the private club is thick with more than just cigar smoke. It is laden with a volatile mixture of rage and disbelief, a palpable shock that has for once rendered its most famous member almost speechless. Across the room, a television screen is tuned to a familiar channel, but the message it now broadcasts feels like the deepest of betrayals. The narrative, once meticulously crafted and amplified in lockstep, has violently fractured. This is no longer about policy or polls. It is a profound personal and political schism that threatens to unravel a decades-old alliance that reshaped the political landscape of the most powerful nation on earth. This rupture centers on the incendiary issue of immigration, a cornerstone of political identity, but the true shockwave emanates from the source of the criticism. The Murdoch media empire, long perceived as a steadfast amplifier, has pivoted with startling ferocity. Headlines and segments from Fox News, The New York Post, and The Wall Street Journal editorial board are no longer offering tactical advice or muted concern. They are launching direct, sustained attacks on the former president's rhetoric and strategy regarding the border and immigration and customs enforcement. To the object of their criticism, this is not mere commentary. It is an act of war declared by former generals, and the response is a meltdown witnessed in private, but felt across the entire political ecosystem. To understand the seismic nature of this breach, one must revisit the origins of this formidable partnership. The political marriage between Donald Trump and Rupert Murdoch's outlets was not one of immediate affection, but of ruthless utility. In the lead-up to the 2016 election, Fox News, particularly its primetime opinion hosts, became a de facto campaign channel, translating Trump's instinctual messaging into a potent, cohesive ideology for millions of viewers. The New York Post provided the tabloid punch, while the Wall Street Journal's editorial page lent a veneer of policy gravitas to the right-wing populist project. This symbiotic relationship proved extraordinarily effective. The media empire provided a massive captive audience and a protective shield, deflecting scandals and amplifying attacks on opponents. In turn, Trump delivered ratings, relevance, and a political revolution that entrenched the network's influence at the very heart of the Republican Party. The boundary between journalism and advocacy became irrevocably blurred, creating a feedback loop where the network's narrative and the politician's agenda were indistinguishable. It was a closed ecosystem of power, resistant to external fact-checking and internal dissent. For years, the alliance weathered internal tensions. Murdoch himself was known to harbor private doubts, and some journalists within his organizations chafed at the directives. Yet the commercial and political incentives to maintain the partnership overwhelmingly prevailed. The network's dominance was tied to the movement Trump commanded, even after the 2020 election and the January 6th Capitol attack, which led to brief moments of distance. The essential dynamic reasserted itself. The calculus seemed clear. The audience was loyal to Trump, and therefore the empire's outlets must remain, fundamentally, in his corner to retain that audience and its political sway. The current crisis, however, appears to have fundamentally altered that calculus. The immediate trigger is the political fight over immigration, a defining issue for the Republican base. As the 2024 election cycle intensifies, the strategic divergence has become a chasm. Trump's posture has been one of uncompromising militancy, opposing bipartisan Senate deals and demanding maximalist rhetoric and policy. His recent comments, widely interpreted as likening immigrants to subhuman invaders and suggesting they are poisoning the blood of the country, have become a critical flashpoint. Initially, the Murdoch outlets followed a familiar playbook, framing the border situation as a Biden administration failure. Yet, as legislative negotiations unfolded, a split emerged. The Wall Street Journal editorial board, a bellwether for the Murdoch establishment's thinking, began publishing pieces championing the bipartisan Senate deal and explicitly criticizing Trump for sabotaging it for political gain. This was not a minor policy disagreement. It was an accusation that the former president was placing his own electoral interests above national security and the functional governance of the country. Then the criticism escalated and spread. Key Fox News anchors, long considered reliable allies, began questioning the wisdom of Trump's strategy on air. Analysts noted that blanket opposition to a deal featuring significant conservative wins could backfire politically, handing President Biden a weapon. The New York Post ran a now infamous front page pleading, "Let's end this madness," and calling for the bipartisan deal to pass. For Trump and his inner circle, this was not analysis, it was mutiny broadcast on his own propaganda network. Insiders describe the reaction at Mar-a-Lago and within the Trump campaign as volcanic. Advisors accustomed to a compliant media ecosystem found themselves scrambling to counter narratives flowing from what was once a friendly shore. The former president, according to multiple sources familiar with his recent private gatherings, has erupted in fury, denouncing Murdoch, his son Lachlan, and specific anchors in profanity-laden tirades. He perceives the coverage not as disagreement, but as a personal betrayal by a vassal state, a profound challenge to his authority over the party and its messaging. The political consequences of this schism are immediate and chaotic. Congressional Republicans, who for years have taken cues from the aligned forces of Trump's tweets and Fox News's primetime lineup, now face conflicting signals. The unified messaging machine has broken down. Lawmakers are caught between the ire of a likely nominee who demands absolute loyalty and a powerful media apparatus, suggesting that loyalty is leading them off an electoral cliff. The result is legislative paralysis and public infighting, weakening the party's stance on the very issue it claims to own. Beyond Capitol Hill, the conflict is forcing a reckoning within the broader conservative movement. Donors, activists, and local party officials are watching the spectacle with growing anxiety. The immigration issue is mobilizing, but the message is now discordant. Does the base follow Trump's call for unwavering obstruction, or does it heed the Murdoch commentators arguing for strategic compromise and electoral pragmatism? This civil war, fought on cable news and front pages, threatens to fracture the monolithic voter bloc that has been the key to Republican power for nearly a decade. Media analysts observing the rift point to several structural factors that made this rupture inevitable. The relationship was always transactional, not ideological, notes Dr. Evelyn Reed, a professor of political communication at Columbia University. Murdoch's entities are ultimately driven by commercial stability and a certain vision of conservative governance. Trump is driven by personal grievance and a disruptive political identity. For a long time, those goals aligned. On immigration, they have now collided. The empire is prioritizing its own long-term influence over short-term fealty to one man. Further insights come from former insiders. A former senior Fox News producer, speaking on condition of anonymity, suggests the shift is also generational and cultural. There is a power struggle within the Murdoch empire itself, with younger executives and some journalists increasingly uncomfortable with the network's perceived servitude to Trump's most extreme impulses. The immigration debate became the acceptable vector to reassert some independence, to try to recapture a shred of journalistic credibility with a broader audience, even at the risk of angering the core viewership. The global implications are significant. Rupert Murdoch's news outlets span the Anglosphere, from the UK to Australia. Their editorial stance influences conservative politics worldwide. A visible, bitter divorce from Trumpism sends a signal to allied parties in other nations. It suggests a possible recalibration away from the most populist, confrontational styles of leadership, potentially isolating figures who modeled themselves on the former president. The fallout is being closely studied in London, Canberra, and beyond as a case study in how media kingmakers can attempt to cut loose a political force they helped create. For the Biden administration and Democratic strategists, the public feud is an unexpected but welcome development. It fractures the once unified opposition media front, allowing their messaging on immigration, portraying Trump as the obstructionist, to reach audiences it previously could not penetrate. Campaign officials privately acknowledge that having Fox News and the Wall Street Journal critique Trump's position validates their own argument in the eyes of moderate and independent voters, potentially turning a historical weakness into a contested issue. The human impact of the policy impasse, however, remains devastating and largely unaddressed. At overcrowded processing facilities in Texas and Arizona, ICE agents and Border Patrol officers caught in the political crossfire describe a system at the breaking point. We are told to enforce the law, but the laws are outdated, the resources are strained, and the political leadership from both parties offers only chaos, says one veteran agent, who requested anonymity for fear of reprisal. The war on TV has nothing to do with the reality here on the ground. Economists and national security experts warn of the tangible costs of perpetual crisis. Unchecked migration strains local economies and social services, while a broken legal immigration system hinders businesses seeking skilled labor. A nation's border policy is a cornerstone of its sovereignty and economic health, says former Homeland Security Secretary Michael Chertoff. When that policy is held hostage by a media-fueled political civil war, the nation itself becomes less secure and less stable. This is not a game. The consequences are measured in security risks and lost prosperity. Looking forward, the trajectory of this conflict is dangerously unpredictable. One scenario sees a temporary tense truce. Facing a dip in ratings or pressure from pro-Trump shareholders, the Murdoch outlets could soften their criticism and return to a more familiar supportive posture. This would require Trump to moderate his rhetoric, a concession he has shown little inclination to make. The fundamental rift over strategy and power would remain simmering until the next flashpoint. A second, more likely scenario is an escalation. Trump, with his massive direct reach via social media and rallies, could fully turn his fire on Fox News, urging his supporters to abandon the network. He has already promoted alternatives like Newsmax and One America News. A full-blown boycott campaign could crater Fox's ratings, devastating its advertising revenue and cultural power. This would be a high-stakes gamble for both sides, a mutually assured destruction of the conservative media political complex as it has existed for 8 years. A third scenario involves a permanent realignment. The Murdoch empire might be signaling a deliberate pivot toward a post-Trump conservatism, one that embraces populist economics, but seeks to shed the movement's most inflammatory rhetoric and legal entanglements. This would be a long, painful process fraught with financial risk, as it would involve cultivating a new audience while potentially alienating its core. It would also leave Trump to build his own media ecosystem entirely, further radicalizing the portion of the electorate that remains loyal to him. The risks for American democracy are profound. A unified partisan media sphere has been a key driver of political polarization. Its fragmentation could lead to even more extreme epistemic divides, with voters inhabiting entirely separate information universes with no common set of facts. Alternatively, if the Murdoch shift is sustained, it could create a space for more reality-based debate on the right, potentially moderating political discourse. The outcome hinges on whether commercial incentives ultimately favor conflict or consensus. Internationally, allies and adversaries are watching with a mix of bewilderment and strategic calculation. The spectacle of a leading candidate and a dominant media empire engaging in public warfare over a core national security issue projects an image of profound dysfunction. It undermines the credibility of the United States as a stable negotiating partner and weakens its moral authority on the global stage. Autocratic regimes are already using the chaos to bolster their own narratives about the decline of Western democratic systems. As the 2024 election looms, this internal war guarantees that the campaign will be fought on unstable, contested terrain. The immigration issue, once a reliable cudgel for Republicans, is now a double-edged sword. The messaging machine that once delivered victories is now firing upon itself. The result is a political environment of unprecedented volatility, where the traditional levers of power and persuasion are no longer reliably connected. In the end, the meltdown is not merely about one man's temper or one network's editorial line. It is the cracking of a fundamental pillar of modern American power. The alliance between Trump and Murdoch did not just report on a political shift, it actively engineered it, bending reality to its will. That engine has now seized. The sparks flying are igniting the very foundations of the political landscape, with no one able to predict what will be left standing when the fire finally burns out. The war for the border has been eclipsed by a war for the soul of the conservative movement, a conflict being waged not in the halls of Congress, but in broadcast studios and headlines. With the future of a nation hanging in the balance,